When I was a junior in high school, we lived in an old two-story house in a quiet suburban area in the United States. The house had a certain charm with its creaky wooden floors and vintage furniture, but at night it often felt unsettlingly quiet. My bedroom was upstairs, while my parents' bedroom was on the ground floor. I had grown used to the occasional creaks and groans of the old house as it settled during the night, but one particular night left a mark on me that I would never forget. It was a cold winter night, and I woke up shivering. I glanced at the clock on my nightstand. It read 2:47 a.m. The room was unusually cold, and the silence felt heavier than usual. Pulling the blanket tighter around me, I tried to convince myself to go back to sleep. Just as I began to drift off, I heard faint footsteps coming from downstairs. They were light, deliberate, and slow, too measured to be the wind or the usual creaks of the house. At first, I dismissed the sound as one of my parents getting up for a glass of water. But as the minutes passed, the footsteps didn't stop. Instead, they continued, pacing back and forth in what sounded like the living room. Unease began to creep in, and my heart started to race. The pattern of the steps didn't make sense. It was as if someone was walking aimlessly. Unable to ignore it any longer, I got out of bed and tiptoed to my bedroom door. Slowly opening it, I peered into the hallway. The upstairs was dark, but a faint glow from the streetlights outside cast an eerie light through the living room windows downstairs. Quietly, I crept to the landing and looked over the banister. That's when I saw him. Standing in the middle of the living room was a man. He was tall and slender, wearing a long black coat and a wide-brimmed hat. His back was to me, and he was staring intently out the large window that overlooked our front yard. He didn't move. He didn't make a sound. He just stood there, completely still, as if he were waiting for something or someone. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, unable to look away. A chilling sense of dread washed over me. Who was he? How did he get into our house? And why was he just standing there? My mind raced with questions as I struggled to decide what to do. I couldn't scream. What if he turned around and saw me? I couldn't confront him. He might be armed. The only thing I could think to do was retreat. As quietly as I could, I backed away from the banister and slipped back into my room. I locked the door, grabbed my phone, and called my parents. My voice was trembling as I whispered, "Mom, Dad, there's someone in the house. He's in the living room." Within moments, I heard my parents rushing up the stairs. My dad was holding a baseball bat, and my mom was clutching her phone, ready to call 911. Together, we cautiously made our way downstairs, but when we reached the living room, the man was gone. The room was empty, and everything was just as we had left it. The front door was locked, the windows were shut and latched, and there were no signs of forced entry. The three of us searched the entire house, but we found nothing. My dad checked the backyard and even walked around the block, but there was no trace of anyone. It was as if the man had vanished into thin air. The next morning, as the sun rose and the events of the night felt more like a bad dream, my mom went to open the curtains in the living room. That's when she saw it. On the outside of the large window, right where the man had been standing, was a faint but unmistakable handprint. The smudged outline of a palm and 5 long fingers was pressed against the glass, as if someone had leaned in to peer inside. We never figured out who that man was or how he got into the house. Over the following weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I walked home from school or went out into the yard, I felt eyes on me. At night, I'd wake up to every little noise, my heart pounding as I imagined the man standing in the living room again. My parents tried to reassure me, but I could see the worry in their eyes. They had no explanation for what had happened, and that made it all the more terrifying. Over time, we moved to another house in a different neighborhood, but the memory of that night stayed with me. Even now, years later, I sometimes wake up at 2:47 a.m., my heart racing as I recall the silhouette of the man in the dark. I've heard stories about shadowy figures and strange visitors, but none of them quite match what I experienced. Whoever or whatever he was, I hope I never see him again. Yet sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I can't help but feel that he's still out there, watching, waiting, standing in the dark. When I moved into a new apartment with my best friend, we were beyond excited. The place was modern, spacious, and conveniently located near the city center. Everything about it seemed perfect at first glance. However, our excitement soon gave way to unease as strange occurrences began to disrupt our lives. It started during the first week. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard the unmistakable creak of the bathroom door opening. Assuming it was my roommate, I paid no attention. But when I glanced down the hallway, I saw the bathroom door standing wide open, its dark interior visible from where I stood. My roommate's bedroom door was shut, and when I peeked inside, she was sound asleep. The sight of her peacefully snoozing sent a chill down my spine. If she hadn't opened the door, then who had? I shrugged it off, convincing myself it must have been a draft. But as the days went on, more unsettling things began to happen. One morning, I came home from work to find the kitchen sink filled with water. It looked as though someone had been washing their hands, yet I knew I had cleaned and emptied the sink before leaving that morning. My roommate hadn't been home all day, and I was the last one to leave the apartment. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe there was a plumbing issue. Maybe the faucet had been left slightly on, though I was certain it hadn't. Then, one evening, I was alone in the apartment watching TV in the living room. The dim glow of the screen illuminated the room, and the only sound was the muffled dialogue of the sitcom playing. Suddenly, I heard faint footsteps behind me. At first, I thought it was my roommate, but when I turned around, no one was there. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Before I could make sense of it, the door to my bedroom, which had been firmly shut, began to open slowly. The creak of the hinges echoed through the silent apartment, and I felt my stomach drop. I was frozen in place, staring at the door as it moved. It stopped when it was halfway open, as though someone or something had decided to pause. I grabbed my phone and called my roommate, who was out with friends. When she answered, I tried to sound calm but failed miserably. "Something's not right here," I whispered. "I think there's someone in the apartment." She rushed home immediately, but by the time she arrived, everything was back to normal. My bedroom door was shut, and the apartment was eerily quiet. Our unease grew as the occurrences became more frequent and harder to dismiss. Lights flickered on and off without warning. Objects moved from where we'd left them, and faint whispers could sometimes be heard late at night. The final straw came one night when both of us were in the apartment. We were in the kitchen chatting when we heard a loud crash from the living room. Rushing to see what had happened, we found one of the framed photos on the wall lying face down on the floor, the glass shattered. The nail it had hung on was still securely in the wall. It was as though someone had ripped it off and thrown it. Desperate for answers, we invited a friend who claimed to have knowledge of the supernatural and feng shui. After walking through the apartment, he looked visibly disturbed. "This place has a heavy energy," he said. "Something happened here. Something tragic." He explained that 10 years ago, a man had died in the apartment after a terrible accident. Whether it was an accidental fall or something more sinister, he couldn't say, but he believed that the spirit of the deceased hadn't moved on. Despite his reassurances that cleansing rituals and certain protective charms could help, the tension in the apartment became unbearable. We both started having trouble sleeping, plagued by vivid nightmares and a constant sense of being watched. Every creak of the floor, every groan of the building, felt amplified, as though the apartment itself was alive and breathing. We finally decided to break our lease and move out. Packing our belongings, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being observed. On the last night, as we finished loading the final boxes into the moving truck, I took one last look at the apartment. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing in the window, watching us leave. But when I blinked, it was gone. Even now, years later, I can't fully explain what happened in that apartment. My roommate and I have since gone our separate ways, but every so often, we catch up and reminisce about our time there. Inevitably, the conversation turns to the strange events, and we both agree something else was living in that apartment with us. Whatever it was, I hope it stays far away from wherever I call home. Life after the apartment brought its own challenges, but the memory of that place continued to haunt me. It was as if a shadow of the experience had followed me. I moved into a studio downtown, small but cozy, and tried to rebuild a sense of normalcy. For the first few weeks, nothing strange happened. The peace was a relief until one night, I heard it again. The faint creak of a door hinge. My studio apartment didn't even have a traditional door to the bathroom, just a sliding partition, and it was shut tight. Yet the sound was unmistakable, coming from somewhere in the hallway outside my door. Gathering my courage, I opened the door to peek into the hallway. It was empty, dimly lit by the flickering overhead light. My neighbors' doors were all closed. I told myself it was just my imagination, but sleep didn't come easily that night. The following weeks brought more strange incidents. My belongings began to go missing, only to reappear in odd places. A favorite necklace I always kept on my dresser showed up on the kitchen counter. A book I'd left on the coffee table was tucked under my pillow. Each time I tried to rationalize it, I must have moved these things and forgotten. But the frequency of these events made that explanation harder to believe. One night, I woke up to the sensation of someone sitting on the edge of my bed. My eyes shot open, and for a split second, I thought I saw the faint outline of a figure. It was gone in an instant, leaving me questioning whether I'd imagined it. But the weight on the bed had felt real. I started keeping a journal of the occurrences, hoping to find some pattern or explanation. Instead, the entries became a chronicle of my growing paranoia. The faint footsteps, the creaking doors, the misplaced items, all of it pointed to something I couldn't see but could undeniably feel. Desperate for answers, I reached out to a paranormal investigator I'd found online. He agreed to visit and set up equipment to monitor the apartment. The night he came, I felt both apprehensive and hopeful. He set up cameras, audio recorders, and even a thermal imaging device. We sat in silence as the equipment ran, the air in the room feeling heavier with each passing hour. At around 3 a.m., one of the audio recorders picked up something chilling. A faint, raspy whisper that neither of us had spoken. "Leave," it said. The investigator's face turned pale as he played it back for me. "You need to leave this place," he said firmly. "Whatever's here doesn't want you here." I moved out the following week, breaking yet another lease. Friends and family started to worry about me, suggesting that my experiences might be psychological. But I knew what I had felt, what I had heard. The sense of being watched, the inexplicable events, they weren't in my head. Years have passed, and I've since settled into a home that feels safe. Yet, every so often, I wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, expecting to hear the creak of a door or see a shadow move across the room. The past lingers, a reminder that some doors, once opened, are not so easily closed. This story took place when I was about 10 years old. My family lived in a small house on the edge of a dense forest in the United States. The house, though modest, had a cozy charm to it. My bedroom was at the end of a narrow hallway, separated from my parents' room by a few feet of creaky wooden floorboards. I often enjoyed the solitude of my little space, but one night changed everything. It was late, close to midnight. The moon cast silvery beams through the curtains of my small window, creating shadows that danced across the room. I was deep in sleep when I was suddenly awoken by a sound that sent chills down my spine. It was laughter, soft, childlike, and unsettlingly close. At first, I thought I must have been dreaming. I blinked in the dark, straining to listen. But the sound came again, clearer this time. It was unmistakably a child's laughter, light and airy, yet with an icy undertone that made my skin crawl. Terrified, I pulled the blanket over my head, hoping the sound would go away. But it didn't. Instead, it grew louder and seemed to move closer, as if the source of the laughter was approaching my bed. My heart raced and my palms grew sweaty. I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. Gathering every ounce of courage I had, I peeked out from under the blanket. What I saw will haunt me forever. In the middle of my room, bathed in the pale glow of moonlight, stood a small figure. It looked like a child, but something about it was terribly wrong. Its face was unnaturally pale, and its eyes, they were completely black, void of any whites or pupils. The figure was grinning, its mouth stretched impossibly wide, revealing teeth that were sharp and glistening. It just stood there, staring at me, laughing softly as if mocking my fear. I screamed. My voice pierced the silence of the night, and within moments, my parents burst into the room. My father flipped on the light switch, and I looked around frantically. The figure was gone. The room was empty. My parents tried to console me, chalking it up to a nightmare. My father checked every corner of the house, but there was no sign of anything unusual. Despite their reassurances, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there. In the following nights, the sense of unease grew. Though I never saw the figure again, I always felt like I was being watched. The laughter didn't return, but the oppressive silence in the room became its own form of terror. I started sleeping with a night light, hoping it would keep the darkness, and whatever was in it, at bay. The days dragged on, but the nights felt endless. I began noticing other strange things around the house. My toys would sometimes be rearranged when I woke up, lined up in perfect rows across the floor. Books would fall off the shelves for no apparent reason, and the air in my room often felt heavy, as if someone was standing just behind me. My parents insisted these were just coincidences or my imagination playing tricks on me, but I knew better. One particularly unsettling incident happened when my cousins came to visit. We were playing hide and seek in the house, and one of my cousins, Emma, decided to hide in my closet. After a few minutes, we heard her scream. When we rushed to find her, she was sitting on the floor of the closet, pale and shaking. She said she had heard someone whispering her name, even though no one else was near her. Emma refused to go back into my room for the rest of her visit. As time went on, I became increasingly withdrawn. I avoided my room as much as possible, spending more time in the living room or outside. But no matter where I went, the feeling of being watched followed me. It was as if the presence in my room had begun to seep into the rest of the house. Years later, after we had moved away from that house, I learned something chilling. A neighbor who had lived in the area for decades told me a story about the house. Decades ago, a family had lived there with a young son. One day, the boy wandered into the forest behind the house and never came back. Despite extensive searches, his body was never found. The family moved away shortly after, unable to bear the loss. Since then, rumors had swirled that the house was cursed, that the boy's spirit still lingered, searching for something or someone. This revelation brought back memories I had tried to bury. I began to wonder, was the figure I saw that night the spirit of the missing boy? Was his laughter a cry for help or something more sinister? I decided to dig deeper, hoping to find answers. I returned to the area years later as an adult to visit the house. It had been abandoned for years, overgrown with weeds and vines. The windows were boarded up, and the paint was peeling off the walls. As I stood there, staring at the house that had haunted my childhood, I felt a familiar chill run down my spine. I couldn't bring myself to go inside, but I did walk around the property, hoping to find some clue about what had happened there. In the backyard, I found a small clearing where the forest began. The trees loomed tall and dark, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out the sunlight. It was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. As I stood there, I thought I heard faint laughter carried on the wind. It was distant and fleeting, but unmistakable. My blood ran cold. The experience left me with more questions than answers. Who was the boy that disappeared? What happened to him in those woods? And why did his spirit seem to linger in that house? I've read countless stories and articles about similar hauntings, but none have given me the closure I'm looking for. All I know is that some part of him, or whatever he became, is still out there waiting, watching, and laughing in the night. Even now, as an adult, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, ears straining for the sound of laughter. It's been years since I've set foot in that town, but the memories remain as vivid as ever. The laughter, the black eyes, the sense of being watched, they've become a part of me, a shadow I can never quite escape. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder if he's still out there, searching for someone else to share in his terrible game.
Thanks for listening to today's story. Let us know what you think. If you want to hear more scary stories, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode when we upload it. We'll always be here and welcome you.